Boozy Lancers, this is a special edition of the Indigenous Minute. On Thursday, May 27, 2021, the Kamloops to Secwepemc Nation confirmed the remains of 215 lost loved ones. Children were found on site at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. They were found over the Victoria Day long weekend using the ground-penetrating radar. There are no records of these deaths, and therefore these missing children are undocumented deaths. Some are as young as 3 years old. The Kamloops Indian Residential School was in operation from 1890 to 1969, when the federal government took over administration from the Catholic Church to operate it as a residence for a day school, until closing in 1978. Up to 500 students would have been registered at the school per year, according to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Those children would have come from First Nation communities across BC and beyond. We need to recognize the tragic, heartbreaking devastation that the Canadian residential school system has inflicted upon so many, and our thoughts should be with all of those who are in mourning today. There will be many questions to answer about how these children died, given the rampant sexual and physical abuse documented in residential schools. Death records were not kept properly, as the children weren't treated with dignity and respect, because that was the whole purpose of the residential school, which was to take total control of the Indian children to remove their culture, identity, and connection to their family. The real intention of the residential school system was to remove the Indian from the child. The survivors of the residential schools and their family carry the burden of this tragedy, and it will affect generations to come. This situation illustrates the damaging and lasting impacts that the residential school system continues to have on First Nations people, their families, and communities. It is estimated more than 150,000 children attended residential schools in Canada from the 1830s until the last school closed in 1996. It is estimated about 4,100 children died at the school, based on death records, but the true total is much higher. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission said that large numbers of Indigenous children who were forcibly sent to residential schools never returned home. We need to recognize, honor, and respect all Indigenous children who lost their lives and those that survived the residential schools. There are 3 things you can do today to acknowledge the tragedy of the residential school system and show respect and honor to all those that lost their lives and those that survived the horrific experience. Wear orange today, May 31st. That supports Every Child Matters, and to honor the 215 Indigenous children who never returned home and whose remains were recently located at the former Kamloops Residential School. And give support for Bill C-5, which calls for September 30th to be a national holiday called Orange Shirt Day, which is a national day of truth and reconciliation. Another way to recognize this tragedy is to put a teddy bear on your porch and leave your porch light on today to help mourn the Kamloops residential school victims. The third way is to visit Kettle and Stony Point. The Kettle and Stony Point First Nation began a memorial at the Veterans Monument. People were asked to place shoes around the monument to symbolize the 215 lost lives in Kamloops residential schools. The shoes were placed in a heart around the monument, and the flags were at half-mast. I went to Kettle and Stony Point on Sunday to lay 2 pairs of shoes I wore as a child to recognize the tragedy. There were family and friends from the reserve that were also laying shoes. While I was there were also people who drove from London and Sarnia to participate in the memorial to residential school victims. It was so nice to see the support from many different communities and the respect they showed the memorial. Thank you to the Lambton-Kent District School Board, which has lowered their flags to half-mast to acknowledge the loss of the children's lives at Canadian residential schools and show respect for the 215 children discovered in mass graves in Kamloops. It is important to acknowledge the atrocity of the Canadian residential schools and the intergenerational trauma and legacies that have been placed on the Indigenous community. My heart goes out to the Kamloops to Secwepemc Reserve and the families that have lost their children. Miigwech.